Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I'm going to talk about These Are the Voyages. This is the first of the Star Trek Adventures adventure collections. This is not a campaign, this is a series of 8 episodes, so to speak. Just little adventures. Each one of them will take 2, maybe 3 sessions to get through. Depends on your playgroup. Some of them are excellent, and some of them are lackluster. They are lacking in luster, which is not to say that they're bad, just that it will take some effort on your part as the game master to polish them up to a shine. So let's go through. I do this kind of review in the past where I talk about, all the little adventures in an anthology or a collection one at a time. And I'm going to start with the one I like the least, and then go up to the one I like the best. And so the first half of this is going to sound like I'm just bagging on this book, and that's not true. If I did not recommend it, I would not be posting a review of it. It is good, but some of the early adventures have some flaws, and you'll have to work through them or work around them in order to make them really work for your group. So the the first one, the one that I think is the least useful or the least polished in the group, is called Entropies Demise. And this is kind of an adventure in the classic style of role-playing. And by classic, I mean the first half of it is a railroad and the second half of it is just a dungeon crawl. It's a very weird adventure structurally, because basically, like the opening of it, the hook that gets you in is your characters are flying around in a ship, and then an admiral or whoever contacts them and says, hey, there's this planet where everyone is aging at a accelerated rate, and crops are growing so fast that they rot, and buildings are starting to like decay and fall apart, and obviously something's wrong. Go check it out. And then the very next thing that happens begins with the characters beaming down to the surface. And I can tell you right now, I have never, in my 30 years of GMing, I have never had a playgroup that would beam down to that planet after that warning. They would arrive, they would immediately scan things to figure out what's going on, they would find the thing that's causing the problem, and then they would go deal with that. But the adventure assumes that there's 2 other major sections prior to that, because they're going to go down and expose themselves to a potentially harmful thing without having scanned anything first, and then eventually, after they finish the first 2 things, then they do a scan, and then they figure out where the problem's coming from and they go deal with it. If you've got an intelligent group of players, this adventure falls to pieces instantly. However, that said, the core of this adventure, the hook behind it, is compelling. Like, a planet where everything is aging at a catastrophically rapid rate, you can see that being a really good episode of a Star Trek show, right? And so the pieces are there to produce something good, but it is going to take a lot of work. Anyway, we'll move on. The next one is called A World with a Bluer Sun. And this one shares a lot of problems with that first one, in that it feels kind of railroady. It feels like there's not a lot of meaningful motivations for any of the characters to do the things that they are doing. On top of that, there's a lot of scientific problems with the adventure that it doesn't deal with appropriately. In brief, and without too many spoilers, part of the problem is that there is a time dilation effect being caused by a black hole. And so there's a ship that's been trapped there for 100 years, but only 2 years have passed for them. And there's a nearby planet where it's a little further away, and so 6 years have passed for the planet, whereas, the rest of the galaxy, 100 years have gone by. And so there's a compelling story happening on the ship. and I don't want to spoil what any of that is. But no part of the adventure deals with that time dilation effect. The fact that time has been dilated doesn't actually matter to anything in the story. And so, I mean, the two options are A, that the characters are going to get hung up on it and keep wondering, well, why is that part of the story? No, it's not part of the plot in any way. B, the characters are going to try to use that to their advantage. One thing, for example, that I love about Star Trek Adventures is that you've got your player characters, but then you also have the rest of the crew. And there's game mechanics in place to do different scenes as kind of the lower decks characters. Let's say that no one in your group wanted to be the doctor, for example. You've got like a science officer and the captain and the first officer and a helmsman, and those are your four people. None of those are the doctor or the engineer or whoever, but we assume that on your ship you still have them, and so you can say, well, for this next scene, I'm going to play as the doctor instead. And so you get a really nice way of doing the whole crew. Well, if your doctor is on a ship that's outside of that time dilation effect, as the adventure assumes they will be, time is passing anywhere from 3 to 50 times more rapidly for the doctor back on the ship than it is for the characters on the thing. And so it's very easy, and I think incredibly sensible, for your players, when they realize what's going on, to say, oh, well, I'm going to play the next scene as the doctor back on the ship, and then you've got between 3 and 50 times as much time to solve this problem. And it just, I don't know. The adventure doesn't deal with that in any way, doesn't give you any guidance as a game master for what's going to happen when you teleport people inside of this time dilation effect. How is that going to affect the storytelling? How's that going to affect the people back on the ship? There's just, and that is merely indicative of the kinds of holes that are there. Now, that said, the adventure, again, the core of it is solid. The foundation is good. There are actually two different problems going on. One of them is a really, actually, very compelling investigation. And then one of them is this really interesting kind of negotiation, diplomatic problem as you try to deal with two, or actually three factions who hate each other. And you're trying to solve a problem between them. So there's some good stuff in there, but again, you're going to require a lot of work to make that adventure work. And for me, if I'm going to buy an adventure supplement, the whole reason to buy that adventure supplement is because it offloads a lot of the work that the game master has to do. If I'm just going to tell my own stories, I can tell my own stories without needing a published book for. If I have a published book that still makes me do all the work myself, then why am I buying a published book, right? So anyway, there you go. The next one is called Forest of the Night. Forest of the Night is a really awesome scene 2 from a larger episode that this book does not provide you with. Basically, they present to you a setting that is devoid of story. There's conflict involved. Essentially, you find a giant floating arboretum in space. And there's certainly a lot of stories you could tell surrounding that. The Arboretum has a fascinating backstory, but the adventure as published is woefully incomplete because all it says is, check out this sweet Arboretum, and then there's no narrative attached to it whatsoever. And you will have to, again, do all of that work yourself, which I find annoying and frustrating. But if you're willing to, this giant floating arboretum is actually a really great setting, like I said, and it's something that you could fit into a larger story, or even spin off. Because of the compelling backstory that it has, you could spin off an entire story arc of multiple episodes sparked by or involving this giant deep space arboretum. But anyway, so next up is one called The Shepherd. These are getting into the ones that I actually really like a lot. Um, the Shepherd is a very cool story that is about a loss of control. Very classic Star Trek episode in that sense, that something is clearly affecting people. And the whole gimmick of the episode, of the adventure, which is both the great thing about it and the one problem I have with it, is that it assumes that that problem, the thing causing all of the mental discrepancies, is going to end up on your ship. And I'm trying to do this without any spoilers. There is no reason. This is just like with that first one I talked about, where it just assumes, and then they all beam down to the ship. This one it says, and then you will beam everybody up to your ship. Why? There's no good reason given in the adventure for you to beam anyone up to your ship. It just assumes that you will, because if you don't, there's not a story. So that is the one and only, okay, there's actually two speed bumps in this story, but that first one, once you can overcome that speed bump, if you as the game master fabricate a reason to get them to beam people up to your ship, well then okay, then we can go and the rest of the story works. The larger issue with the story, that isn't as much of a bottleneck as that one, it just kind of is frustrating to me, is that the fact that there are problems and the types of problems that there are don't relate to each other in any way. I like what they're doing and I like what they're going for, but I wish, as a storyteller, that there was a stronger connection, thematically or even just narratively, between what's causing the problem and the problem that gets caused. They don't actually relate to each other in any way, which is frustrating. But again, that's something that might not be an issue for a lot of groups, and it's something that you can work around if you want to do it. So anyway, it's a really cool, like I said, classic Star Trek episode kind of thing. You just have to put in a lot of work. All right, so now we're in the top half, and this is where they're starting to get even better. The next one is called A Plague of Arias, which, just in the title, gives away one of the big secrets that you're supposed to figure out over the course of the adventure. Essentially, there is a plague that causes people to sing, and that it is, a virus, so to speak. I mean, it's not a virus, but the idea that it is a disease or a sickness that is being transmitted sonically is fascinating and is really cool science fiction storytelling. And what this episode does is it takes that idea and it spins out this really interesting plot around it. Not only does it give it a good backstory, why is there a sonic disease, but then how is that going to affect us? What is that what is that going to do? What problems is that going to cause? And it does a really good job of putting all of those pieces into place. I still think that it'll take a little bit of polish. I think that most game masters reading this will have the same questions I had, such as, well, why is this character doing this thing? A lot of the NPC motivations are incredibly thin and flimsy. But if you are willing to work around that relatively minor problem, the rest of this adventure is absolutely rock solid. It has opportunities for science, it has opportunities for combat, it has opportunities for diplomacy, negotiation, everything. And it does a really good job of the story that it is trying to tell. So, A Plague of Arias is great. All right, next one is called Biological Clock. Biological Clock I have one major hangup with Biological Clock, but clearly not a huge one because I put it in here. And this is more than anything else, this is a personal problem. I tend to hate almost every Star Trek episode that deals with the Prime Directive because it is a mess. And the show has never really dealt with it effectively, except for a couple of episodes. I would say, for example, Cogenitor from Enterprise did a really great job of showing the need for a Prime Directive, but also the horrible problems that can be caused when you get down into the nitty-gritty of it. Anyway, and so I'm not going to fault this adventure for falling into the same trap that every Star Trek episode has ever fallen into, which is they don't know how to do the Prime Directive correctly. That said, what can I say non-spoilery about this adventure? You start off by finding a life form, and the first half of the adventure is this really kind of cool science episode. Here's a weird life form. Are they intelligent? Can we communicate with them? How do we make first contact with them? They function biologically very differently than most of the rest of the galaxy, and so it becomes this interesting scientific puzzle with a cool story, and it's really great. And then, halfway through, a different species shows up, and all of a sudden we are thrown into the moral dilemma of how do we interact with these two species together, because they have a problem with each other, and we as the crew are thrown into this. Now, framing that as a Prime Directive problem makes sense, because if the Prime Directive's not in the way, it's very obvious which side is right. Glaringly, painfully obvious. But the Prime Directive does not apply in this situation. The Prime Directive, as Star Trek fans will know, is the rule that says if there is a pre-warp society, if there's a society that has not yet developed interstellar travel, we're not supposed to mess with them because we will mess them up. And so, when this second civilization shows up and the adventure says, oh no, it's a Prime Directive issue, no, it's not. Because they show up from another star in a spaceship, which makes them an interstellar civilization, which means the Prime Directive does not apply to them. Done. If you come up with some other rule that would try to force the characters into a moral quandary here, then that'll work, and it'll work really well. And it is a cool and compelling Star Trek episode idea. But personal hang-ups over Prime Directive. There you go. All right, so now, the last two. These, I don't really have any problem with these at all. I have one problem with one of them, which is why that it is number 7 instead of number 8. So, the next one up is called That Which Is Unknown. Both of these last two are essentially diplomatic negotiations under tense circumstances with Romulans. And that might be my own personal preference stepping in and saying, yeah, I like these stories better. But what I suspect is actually going on is that it is simply easier in a role-playing game to model that kind of scenario than it is to model something larger and more filled with, weird science or something like that. Anyway, That Which Is Unknown is really cool because there is a species. It starts with a species called the Takarans, and they were in one episode of Next Gen. And bonus points to everyone out there who's like, "Oh yeah, I know that episode." They have developed, or are in the process of developing, a new torpedo technology that they want to test. And the test goes horribly wrong. They are attacked by Klingons who steal the prototype and then race off toward Romulan space. And the whole time you're thinking, well, why? Why is any of this happening? It doesn't make any sense. It all does under the hood, and part of the adventure, I guess most of the adventure, is the player's characters have to figure out why. Why did this species do this the way that they did? Why did the Klingons show up? Why are they heading toward Romulan space? Why are the Romulans being kind of prigs about this? And it all eventually works. Part of the problem is that there are two specific things about the Takarans that rely... Let me rephrase that. There's two specific parts of the adventure that rely on your knowledge of Takarans, and the adventure does not provide them. I actually had to go to Memory Alpha, which is the Star Trek kind of wiki website, to figure out who the Takarans were, and you read that description, and then you're like, oh, well, that's why this happens, and then that's also why this happens. And if you don't know that, then it feels like there's two giant plot holes in the adventure, which is annoying. But if you take the time to do some wikiing and you learn all that stuff about the Takarans, then you're set. It might be that the Takarans have shown up in one of the supplements, and I just can't remember. They definitely don't show up as a playable species, but they might be in the background somewhere in like the beta quadrant or something. I don't think so, and even if they are, I think that's cheating. If the adventure requires you to have an extra supplement in order to play it, it should say that, and it doesn't. But, like I said, it's a really good adventure. It is really well put together if you do the homework to figure out why this makes sense. Anyway, really love it. Last one of all is called Border Dispute. It's another Romulan thing. And I love this one in part because I think it is the simplest. It is the one that relies also most heavily on the core mechanics of the Star Trek role-playing game. What happens, more or less, is that a Federation starship accidentally crosses into the neutral zone and then gets immediately attacked and disabled by Romulans. And they had a chance to shoot back before they were disabled, and so the Romulan ship is hanging there, crippled, and the Federation ship is hanging there, crippled. Neither one can move, neither one can do anything, and then you show up and you're like, we got your distress call, how can we help? And they're like, well, technically we broke the law, and the Romulans would be within their rights to drag us back to Romulus and put us on trial. But on the other hand, it was an accident, and they're being jerks about it. Help us. And so your job as the player characters is to stop this from turning into an international incident, to save that entire crew if possible, because A, there's a lot of valuable information on that ship. It's been on an 8-year or 2-year mission, but it's been out for a while. So if the Romulans get their hands on the ship and the crew, they will get unbelievably valuable intel. And also, they might just end up killing or imprisoning all the crew, which does not seem like a good thing. So what you do is you just show up, and then there's this giant laundry list of broken stuff. The computer system's down, the warp core's down, the shields are down, everything is down. How can we solve this problem? And so you're kind of thrown into the woods of extended tasks. And you will get to know how extended tasks work really well in the game, which is good because it's a really great system and it's very simple and easy to use. And so as you go through repairing this ship, one system at a time, one extended task at a time, you get to meet everybody on the crew, and there's a huge cast. And you also get to, discover that there's actually another problem going on, and then you have to solve that. And so it's like I said, it's a relatively simple thing, but it manages to combine, all of the science, all of the engineering, kind of some of the core mechanics of the game, while also being this very interesting diplomatic and political scenario that could potentially result in either physical or space combat, depending on how your players choose to resolve the situation. And there's a lot of different directions it could go. It is the best designed scenario in the book, and one of the best Star Trek scenarios that I've seen. It would make an incredible episode of the show. And it all hangs together really well. So, hooray for Border Dispute. My one issue with Border Dispute would actually be that the Romulans are within their rights, again, because of the treaty of the neutral zone, to observe everything that the ship does. And so while you're repairing it and while you're making it better, they actually can send over a boarding party to observe and make sure that you're not trying to pull any shenanigans. And that is cool. And the adventure says, hey, if you need to add some extra tension onto the players, send over a boarding party, because that'll cause tension. And it will, but it also I can't even say why that's a problem, except that it has the potential to not cause problems, but it has the presence of a boarding party has weird interactions with many of the secrets that the players don't know, and so I'm not saying what they are, and the adventure never really goes into that, which is too bad. But regardless, it's a great adventure. So, at the end of the day, these are the Voyages, 8 Star Trek Adventures scenarios. 4 of them, 5 of them, I would say, are actually very good. 2 of them are fantastic. And even the 3 that I don't think are great could be great if you're willing to put in that effort. None of these are just flatly awful. They're all really fantastic ideas, and just there's 3 of them where the execution isn't where I would want it to be. But even if you never play those 3 at all, the other 5 are fantastic, as is. Slight polish needed, and absolutely going to get your money's worth out of this book. So, these are the Voyages for Star Trek Adventures. Very, very good, and I recommend it to you. So, give it a shot. Star Trek Adventures is my favorite role-playing game, and it is well worth your time. Anyway, I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.